A piercing Wyoming wind howls through the snow-dusted valley of 1878, where Lucas Hale, a hardened cowboy of 36, stands haunted by a past soaked in blood and loss. Beneath his wealth and steely exterior lies a heart frozen by grief, until Anna, a timid orphan with her own scars, steps into his world. Their paths collide in a tale of redemption and courage, where a single act of kindness could thaw the coldest soul. Will love triumph over vengeance? Subscribe now to uncover their journey, and share where you're listening from. What secrets does Anna's crumpled letter hold? Will Lucas find peace? Stay tuned to find out. The Wyoming wind screamed across the valley, sharp as a skinning knife, kicking up clouds of snow that stung like grit against Lucas Hale's weathered face. He stood on the frost-crusted hill overlooking Blackthorn Ranch, his boots sinking into the frozen earth. At 36, he was a man carved from the land itself, broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from reins and rope, and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. The year was 1878, and the sun bled red behind the jagged Tetons, painting the sky like a wound that wouldn't heal. His ranch sprawled below, 3,000 acres of hard-won dirt, dotted with cattle and horses, guarded by men who'd kill for $1. But no amount of wealth could bury the ghosts that haunted him. Under the charred skeleton of an ancient oak, Lucas's gaze lingered. Years ago, that tree had burned in a night of fire and blood, when raiders tore through his home, leaving his wife and son dead in the dirt. Their screams still echoed in his skull, louder than the wind. He'd built an empire since, barns of weathered pine, corrals packed with lowing steers, a ranch house stuffed with Denver finery. But it was all ash in his mouth. The world saw a king of the frontier. Lucas saw a man hollowed out, his heart as cold as the iron on his hip. He pulled his hat low, the brim cutting the wind's bite, and turned toward the ranch house. Its windows glowed faintly, like embers in the dusk. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of cedar and leather, but it did nothing to warm him. He stomped snow from his boots and crossed the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. The house was too big, too quiet, its halls echoing with memories he couldn't outrun. He'd hired men to work the land, guns to guard it, but no one could fill the silence left behind. In the study, a fire crackled, throwing shadows across shelves of untouched books and a desk littered with ledgers. Lucas sank into his chair, the leather groaning. He poured a finger of whiskey from a bottle that cost more than most men's wages, but it tasted like regret. His fingers traced the Colt revolver on the desk, its barrel scratched from years of use. It was his only constant, the one thing that never failed him when the world turned cruel. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, where shadows danced like specters of the past. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the shutters. Lucas's thoughts drifted to the tree, to the blood-soaked dirt beneath it. He'd sworn vengeance that night, and he'd kept that oath, tracking down every man responsible. Their graves dotted the valley, unmarked and forgotten. But justice hadn't brought peace. It had only carved him deeper, leaving a man who trusted no one, who saw betrayal in every stranger's eyes. A knock broke the silence. Martha, the gray-haired housekeeper, poked her head in. "Supper's ready, Mr. Hale. Beef and beans, hot enough to burn the chill off." Her voice was gruff, but her eyes held a flicker of pity Lucas hated. He nodded, waving her off. She hesitated, then added, "There's a girl coming tomorrow, looking for work. Says she's from Cheyenne, but she doesn't look like much. Skinny thing, all bones and nerves." Lucas grunted, uninterested. If she can scrub floors, hire her. If not, send her packing. Martha nodded and left, her footsteps fading down the hall. He didn't care about a drifter girl. The ranch was a machine, and he needed cogs that worked, not baggage. He sipped the whiskey, its burn sharp against his tongue, and stared into the fire. The flames twisted, conjuring faces he'd buried long ago. As night deepened, the wind's wail grew fiercer, like a beast prowling the valley. Lucas stood, restless, and stepped onto the porch again. The stars were sharp, like bullet holes in the black sky. He wondered, not for the first time, if he'd built all this empire of dirt and blood, for nothing. The oak tree loomed in the distance, a dark scar against the snow. Tomorrow, another stranger would walk into his world, another soul he'd keep at arm's length. But something in the wind's howl felt different tonight, like a warning or a promise. That change was coming, whether he wanted it or not. The Wyoming night clung to Blackthorn Ranch like a shroud, its icy breath rattling the windows as Lucas Hale stood on the porch, the wind's howl still ringing in his ears. A promise, or a warning, hung in the air, and he felt it deep in his bones. Dawn broke gray and bitter, the sky heavy with clouds that promised more snow. Lucas pulled his coat tight and trudged toward the barn, his breath clouding in the frigid air. The ranch was stirring, hands shouting orders, horses snorting in the corrals. But his mind was elsewhere, snagged on the stranger Martha had mentioned. Another drifter, he figured, chasing work and a warm meal. He'd seen dozens come and go, their faces blurring into the dust they left behind. By mid-morning, a rickety wagon creaked up the snow-packed trail, its wheels groaning under the weight of a single passenger. Lucas watched from the corral, leaning against a post, his hat tipped low. The driver, old man Tucker from town, reined in the mules and nodded toward a figure stepping down. Anna Whitmore was no more than a wisp of a girl, 19 years old, her frame swallowed by a threadbare shawl and a faded brown dress. Her face was pale, her cheeks hollow, and her gray eyes darted like a spooked colt's, never lingering on anything, or anyone, too long. She clutched a small bundle, her only possessions, and stood frozen as Tucker handed her a crumpled letter before rattling off. Martha met her at the gate, her apron flapping in the wind. "You, the girl from Cheyenne?" she barked, sizing Anna up like a calf at auction. Anna nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, ma'am. Anna Whitmore. I'm here for work." Her words trembled, not just from the cold. Lucas watched from a distance, his arms crossed. She looked like she'd blow away in the next gust, too frail for the brutal work of a ranch. But something in her hunched shoulders, the way she gripped that bundle, stirred a memory he couldn't place, a shadow of himself, years ago, broken and alone. Martha led Anna inside, muttering about extra mouths to feed. Lucas followed, his boots heavy on the porch steps. The kitchen was warm, thick with the smell of coffee and sizzling bacon. Anna stood by the table, her hands twisting the edge of her shawl. Martha shoved a plate toward her. "Eat. You'll need it if you're to scrub floors and haul water." Anna hesitated, then sat, her movements careful, like she was afraid to break something just by existing. Lucas lingered in the doorway, unnoticed, his shadow falling across the floor. He studied her, the way her fingers shook as she picked up a fork, the way her eyes stayed fixed on the plate, avoiding Martha's stare. "You got family?" Martha asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. Anna's fork froze midair. "No, ma'am," she said softly. "Just me." A lie, Lucas thought, catching the flicker of pain in her face. He knew that look, grief buried deep, like a splinter under the skin. Martha pressed. "Cheyenne's a long way. What brought you here?" Anna's lips tightened, and she set the fork down. "Work," she said simply. But her hand drifted to the bundle, where the edge of that crumpled letter peeked out. Lucas's eyes narrowed. That letter was an ordinary keepsake. It was a weight, a chain she carried, He stepped into the room, his spurs jingling faintly. Anna's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his for a heartbeat before dropping again. "Mr. Hale," Martha said. "This is the girl. Says she can clean, cook, whatever you need." Lucas nodded, his voice low and rough. "Can you work hard, girl? This ain't a place for idle hands." Anna's fingers tightened on the bundle. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "I've worked all my life." He held her gaze, searching for weakness, but found something else. Resolve, brittle but unyielding, like a blade tempered by fire. Lucas turned away, dismissing her with a grunt. "Start her on the floors. If she can't keep up, she's gone by week's end." Martha nodded, but Anna's eyes followed him as he left, a spark of defiance flickering in their depths. Outside, the wind kicked up again, swirling snow across the yard. Lucas headed to the barn, his mind already back on cattle counts and fence lines. But that letter, that fleeting look of pain, gnawed at him. Who was she running from? What had carved that fear into her bones? He shook it off, telling himself she was just another hand, another cog in his machine. Yet as he saddled his horse, the wind seemed to whisper her name, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this stranger from afar had brought something dangerous into his world. Not a threat, but a spark that could ignite everything he'd tried to bury. The wind's whisper carried Anna's name as Lucas rode out, the cold biting at his knuckles through worn gloves. Blackthorn Ranch faded into the snow-dusted horizon, but the image of that crumpled letter in her trembling hands clung to him, sharp as a spur in his side. Night fell hard, the kind of dark that swallowed stars and hope alike. Lucas returned to the ranch house, his boots crunching on fresh snow, his thoughts heavy with questions about the stranger now scrubbing his floors. Inside, the warmth of the kitchen lingered, but it was the study where he retreated, where the fire's glow offered a fleeting shield against the ghosts that stalked him. The room was a fortress of solitude, its walls lined with ledgers and maps, the air thick with the scent of old leather and smoke. Lucas sank into his chair, the fire crackling like a restless spirit. He poured a shot of whiskey, but left it untouched, his eyes drifting to the Colt on the desk, its steel glinting in the firelight. He'd built this life on control, on knowing every man, every move, every threat. But Anna Whitmore was a riddle, her quiet defiance, and that damn letter stirring something he couldn't name. He leaned back, loosening his collar, and let his eyes half close, not asleep but waiting, like a hunter in the brush. The house settled into silence, broken only by the wind's low moan. Then, soft as a shadow, the door creaked. Anna slipped in, her steps light on the pine floor, a tray balanced in her hands. She wore the same faded dress, her hair pinned tight, but her movements were steady, deliberate. She set the tray down, a bowl of stew, a hunk of cornbread, a tin cup of water, each motion precise, like she was handling dynamite. Lucas kept still, his breath even, watching through slitted eyes as she moved to the hearth, poking the fire to coax it higher. The flames leapt, casting her face in gold and shadow, revealing lines of weariness no 19-year-old should carry. She paused, her gaze catching on a small wooden box on the mantel, one Lucas hadn't touched in years. It held a locket, his wife's, etched with a rose, now tarnished by time. Anna's fingers hovered, not touching, but her lips parted. "Someone loved this once," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the fire's crackle. "Must have been precious to leave it here, watching over you." She glanced at Lucas, thinking him asleep, and her shoulders softened. "You carry so much, don't you? This big house, all this land. But it's heavy. I know heavy." Her hand slipped to her pocket, where the edge of that letter peeked out, crumpled and worn, like a wound she couldn't close. Lucas's jaw tightened, but he didn't stir. Anna turned back to the fire, adding a log, her movements careful, reverent. "My pa used to say a fire's like hope," she murmured. "Feed it just right, and it'll warm you through the worst nights. Let it die, and you're done for." She laughed softly, a sound sharp with pain. "He fed his hopes wrong, I guess. Left me with nothing but this." She touched the letter, her fingers lingering, then pulled a small jar from her apron. A homemade salve, smelling of herbs and wax. She set it beside the tray, whispering, "For your hands, Mr. Hale. The cold's cruel to them." She stepped closer, her shadow falling over him, and gently draped a wool blanket across his shoulders. Her touch was fleeting, but it burned through him, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Rest easy," she said, her voice soft as a prayer. "You don't have to fight the world alone." She slipped out, the door clicking shut, leaving Lucas staring at the fire, his heart pounding against the cage of his ribs. That letter, her words, her kindness, they were cracks in the iron he'd forged around himself. If this story's pulling you in, folks, hit that subscribe button to keep up with Lucas and Anna's journey. It's a tale of grit and heart, and I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop it in the comments. Your support keeps these stories alive, just like Anna's fire keeps the cold at bay. Lucas sat up, the blanket sliding to the floor. He grabbed the salve, its scent sharp and unfamiliar, and rubbed it into his cracked hands. The letter, her voice, her story. They were threads he couldn't untangle. Who was this girl, carrying her own ghosts, yet tending to his? He stood, pacing to the window, where the snow fell thick and relentless. Outside, the oak tree loomed, its charred branches clawing at the sky. Anna's arrival wasn't just chance. It was a spark, and Lucas felt the ground shifting beneath him, like the first tremor before a stampede. The Wyoming snow fell relentless, a white veil shrouding the charred oak tree that stood like a sentinel over Lucas Hale's past. Its shadow lingered in his mind as he paced the study, Anna's salve still tingling on his hands. Her words, "You don't have to fight the world alone," cutting deeper than any blade. The ranch house groaned under the wind's assault, but Lucas felt a different storm brewing within, one sparked by a girl who saw through his iron walls. As midnight approached, he settled into his chair, the fire's embers glowing low, and closed his eyes, not to sleep but to listen, to unravel the mystery of Anna Whitmore. The night was still, save for the wind's distant howl, when the door creaked open. Anna entered, her lantern casting a faint halo on the pine walls. Her steps were softer now, less cautious, as if the house had begun to feel less like a stranger's domain. She carried no tray tonight, just a rag and a small bucket, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Lucas watched through slitted eyes, his breath steady, as she knelt by the hearth, scrubbing ash from the stone with quiet determination. The firelight danced across her face, catching the faint scar above her brow, a mark Lucas hadn't noticed before, jagged like a story left untold. She worked in silence at first, her movements methodical, but then she paused, resting her hands on the bucket's edge. "This house," she whispered, her voice low, as if speaking to the flames. "It's too big for one man's sorrow. All these rooms, empty, like they're waiting for something." She glanced toward Lucas, believing him asleep, and her gaze softened. "You built this, Mr. Hale, but it ain't home yet, is it? I know that feeling, having nothing left but walls." Her fingers brushed the letter in her pocket, its edges frayed from countless touches, and her voice dropped lower. Pa's store was like that, full of things, but empty after they took him. Lucas's chest tightened, but he held still, his pulse quickening. Anna stood, moving to a shelf where a cracked leather journal sat, its pages yellowed. She didn't open it, just traced its spine with a finger. "Mama used to keep a book like this," she said, her voice catching. "Wrote down recipes, prayers, dreams. Said it kept her steady. I tried, but all I got is Pa's letter, and it's just words that don't fix anything." She laughed, a brittle sound, and turned back to the fire, stirring it until sparks flew like stars against the dark. She sat cross-legged on the hearth, closer to Lucas than she'd ever dared, and pulled the letter from her pocket. Its ink was faded, but she held it like a talisman. "He wrote this the night before they hanged him," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Said he didn't steal no horses, that he'd been framed by men with money and grudges. I was 12. Watched them drag him from our shop, shouting his innocence. Nobody listened." Her fingers tightened, creasing the paper. "I keep it to remember. Justice ain't always just in these parts." Lucas's hands clenched beneath the blanket, his knuckles white. He wanted to speak, to tell her he knew that kind of betrayal, that the frontier chewed up the innocent and spat out their bones. But he stayed silent, letting her words fill the room. Anna tucked the letter away and stood, dusting her hands. "You're a hard man, Mr. Hale," she said softly, glancing at his still form. "But I seen your hands shake when you hold that gun. You're carrying more than this ranch. I just hope you find a way to put it down someday." She moved to the window, peering out at the snow-swept valley. The moonlight caught her silhouette, frail but unyielding, like a sapling in a storm. "Back in Cheyenne, folks said Blackthorn Ranch was cursed," she murmured. "Said the man who runs it don't trust anybody. But I think you're just tired." She turned, her eyes lingering on the locket's box, then on Lucas. "Sleep well, Mr. Hale. Tomorrow's another fight. But maybe it doesn't have to be." She slipped out, her lantern's glow fading down the hall. Lucas opened his eyes, the fire's warmth no match for the heat in his chest. Anna's words, her story, her quiet strength, they were a mirror to his own pain, reflecting a man he'd buried under years of vengeance. He stood, crossing to the window where she'd stood, the snow outside swirling like ghosts. The ranch was his empire, but Anna was right. It wasn't a home. Not yet. And as the wind howled, he felt the first stirrings of something dangerous, a need to know her, to understand the fire that burned in her quiet heart. Lucas stood at the window, the snow's ghostly dance mirroring the turmoil Anna's words had stirred in his chest. Her quiet heart, burning with a fire he couldn't ignore, had left him restless, questioning the walls he'd built around his life. But the Wyoming night offered no answers, only a growing unease that prickled his skin like static before a storm. Dawn broke cold and sharp, the sky a bruised gray over Blackthorn Ranch. Lucas was in the saddle by first light, checking fences with his men. But his mind was back in the study, replaying Anna's whispers about justice and curses. The air felt wrong, heavy with a threat he couldn't name. By dusk, the ranch was a hive of routine, hands herding cattle, the clang of iron from the blacksmith's shed, the low whinny of horses in the corral. Lucas stood on the porch, his breath clouding, when a faint glow flickered on the horizon. Not the sun, but something fiercer, hungrier. A shout split the air. "Fire!" The stables were ablaze, flames licking the night sky, spitting sparks like a devil's laughter. Lucas sprinted toward the chaos, his boots pounding frozen earth, as men scrambled to free the horses. The wind carried the stench of burning hay and something darker. Gunpowder. He spotted them then, shadows moving through the smoke. 6 riders, their faces masked by bandanas, rifles glinting. Jack Tully's gang, outlaws Lucas had once called allies, men he'd paid to guard his land before they turned traitor for a bigger score. They'd come for his cattle, maybe his life. "Spread out," Lucas barked, drawing his Colt. His men fanned across the yard, shots cracking like thunder as bullets tore through wood and flesh. The fire roared, a beast consuming the stables, and Lucas's heart pounded with a fury he hadn't felt since the night under the oak. Through the haze, he saw Anna, her slight figure darting from the kitchen, a bucket in hand, her dress streaked with soot. "Stay back," he shouted, but she didn't hear or didn't care, splashing water at the flames as if she could tame them. A rider broke from the pack, his horse rearing as he aimed his rifle at her. Lucas fired, the man slumping from the saddle, but another grabbed Anna, yanking her against him, a blade flashing at her throat. Her eyes met Lucas's, wide with fear but blazing with defiance, her hand clawing at her captor's arm. "Drop the gun, Hale," the outlaw snarled, his voice muffled but familiar. Cole, Tully's right hand, a snake who'd once shared Lucas's whiskey. "Or she's done." Lucas froze, his Colt steady, but his mind raced. The fire's heat seared his face, the screams of horses and men a cacophony. Anna's captor tightened his grip, and Lucas saw her fingers slip beneath her apron, slow and deliberate. In a heartbeat, she twisted, pulling a small derringer from a hidden pocket and tossing it toward him. It skidded across the dirt, glinting in the firelight. Lucas dove, snatching the gun as bullets whizzed past. He rolled, firing twice, once to drop the outlaw holding Anna, once to scatter the others. She stumbled free, coughing, her face smudged with ash but unbroken. "Get to the house," Lucas roared, but she grabbed a fallen pitchfork, standing her ground as another rider charged. Lucas tackled her out of the way, the horse's hooves missing her by inches. They hit the ground hard, his body shielding hers, the world a blur of smoke and gunfire. The fight turned desperate. Lucas's men drove the remaining outlaws back, their horses bolting into the night as the fire consumed the last of the stables. Lucas hauled Anna to her feet, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with smoke and rage. She shook her head, clutching that crumpled letter, now smeared with dirt. "I couldn't just hide," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Not when they came for you?" He stared at her, this slip of a girl who'd thrown him a lifeline in the chaos, and felt something shift, a crack in the armor he'd worn too long. The fire still burned, but the threat was gone, the night swallowing Tully's men. Lucas's gaze lingered on Anna, her scar stark against her pale skin, her eyes holding a fire that matched the blaze behind them. The ranch was scarred, but standing. And as the wind howled through the wreckage, carrying the stench of ash and blood, Lucas knew this fight had changed something fundamental, not just in the land, but in him. The wind howled through the smoldering wreckage of Blackthorn Ranch, carrying the acrid sting of ash and the weight of Anna's courage, which had seared itself into Lucas Hale's soul. Her derringer, still warm in his hand, was proof of her defiance, a spark that had saved him and shifted the ground beneath his feet. Dawn crept over the Wyoming valley, its pale light exposing the charred remains of the stables, the ground littered with spent shells and hoofprints. The outlaws were gone, swallowed by the night, but the air still crackled with the aftermath of violence, and Lucas knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. He stood in the yard, his Colt heavy at his hip, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Tully's men doubling back. Anna was beside him, her dress torn, her face smudged with soot, but unbowed. She clutched her father's letter, its edges now singed, as if the fire had tried to claim her past, too. Lucas's men were scattered, tending to the freed horses or dousing the last embers, their faces grim under the weight of the night's losses. But one figure remained. Cole, Tully's right hand, sprawled in the dirt, blood pooling from a graze on his shoulder. He was alive, barely, his hands bound with rope, his bandana ripped away to reveal a face twisted with pain and defiance. Lucas towered over him, his shadow long in the dawn's light. "You thought you could take what's mine," he growled, his voice low and jagged, like a blade dragged across stone. Cole spat blood, his laugh a broken rasp. "You're a fool, Hale. Tully knows your weaknesses, your land, your pride. That girl." His eyes flicked to Anna, venomous. "Heard she's the daughter of a horse thief. Bet she's playing you, just like her pa played the law." Anna flinched, her fingers tightening on the letter, but she didn't look away. Lucas's hand twitched toward his Colt, rage boiling in his chest. He'd killed for less, buried men for slights half as sharp. The valley had seen his wrath before, graves unmarked, debts settled in blood. Cole's words were a match to kindling, and Lucas felt the old hunger for vengeance flare, hot and familiar. He drew his gun, the barrel glinting as he pressed it to Cole's forehead. The man's smirk faltered, his eyes widening, but he held his ground, daring Lucas to pull the trigger. "Lucas!" Anna's voice cut through the haze, soft but steady, like a bell in a storm. She stepped forward, her hand brushing his arm, not grabbing but grounding. "Don't," she said, her gray eyes locked on his, unflinching despite the tremor in her frame. "He's baiting you. Kill him, and you're the man they say you are, the one who buries his pain in blood. You're better than that." Her words struck like a hammer on iron, forcing him to see the truth in her gaze. She wasn't pleading for Cole's life. She was fighting for his soul. Lucas's grip tightened, the gun steady, but his mind churned. He saw the oak tree in his memory, its branches burning, his family's screams echoing. He'd sworn then to never let betrayal go unanswered, to carve justice from the frontier's chaos. But Anna's hand on his arm, her letter crumpled but unyielding, reminded him of her story, of a father framed, a life stolen by men like Cole. Killing him would be easy, but it would chain Lucas to the past, to the man he'd been before her quiet fire broke through. He lowered the Colt, his breath ragged, and stepped back. Cole sagged, his bravado crumbling. "Take him to town," Lucas ordered his men, his voice rough but firm. "Let the sheriff deal with him." The hands nodded, dragging Cole to his feet, his curses fading into the wind. Anna's shoulders relaxed, but her eyes stayed on Lucas, searching, as if she saw the war still raging inside him. "You did right," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that anchored him. "Justice ain't always a bullet." Lucas holstered his gun, his hands shaking, not from cold, but from the choice he'd made. The valley stretched before them, scarred but enduring, its snow stained with ash and blood. Anna stood beside him, her letter a silent testament to her own fight for truth. For the first time, Lucas felt the weight of his vengeance lift, replaced by something fragile but real, a spark of redemption, kindled by a girl who'd faced fire and refused to break. As the sun rose, casting long shadows across the ranch, he knew the path ahead would be harder than pulling a trigger. But with Anna beside him, it was a path he might dare to walk. The dawn's light stretched across the Wyoming valley, its rays glinting off the snow and ash. But the spark of redemption Lucas Hale felt beside Anna was fragile, a flame flickering against the bitter wind. Her courage had pulled him back from the edge. Her words, "Justice ain't always a bullet," still ringing in his ears as he stood among the ruins of Blackthorn Ranch. The day wore on, heavy with the work of rebuilding, but the air carried a new weight. Whispers from town, sharp as thorns, ready to draw blood. Lucas sensed it in the sidelong glances of his men, in the clipped words of the supply runners. Something was brewing, and Anna was at its heart. By noon, The ranch was a hive of activity. Men hauling charred timbers, hammering new planks, their breath clouding in the cold. Lucas worked among them, his hands raw from labor, but his eyes kept drifting to Anna. She moved quietly, carrying water to her hands, her dress still torn from the night's chaos, her letter tucked safely in her pocket. Her scar caught the sunlight, a jagged reminder of her own battles. Yet she worked without complaint, her steps steady despite the weight of eyes on her. Lucas noticed the ranch hands' murmurs, their heads turning when she passed, their voices low and guarded. He rode into town that afternoon, needing supplies and answers. The streets of Laramie were a churn of mud and snow, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and horse sweat. The general store was a hub of gossip, its wooden walls echoing with talk that stopped when Lucas entered. Old man Tucker, behind the counter, avoided his gaze, busying himself with a ledger. "Heard about your trouble last night, Hale," he said, his voice tight. "Folks saying that girl of yours brought it on. Daughter of a thief, stirring up ghosts." Lucas's jaw clenched, his hand brushing the colt at his hip, but he kept his tone even. "She saved my ranch. Mind your tongue." The whispers followed him, through the saloon's swinging doors, past the church where women clutched their shawls and muttered. "She's a nobody," one said, loud enough to carry. "Climbing too high, that maid, thinking she can stand beside Hale." Another sneered. "He's lonesome, that's all. Blinded by a pretty face." Lucas pushed past, his boots heavy on the boardwalk, but the words sank deep, each one a barb. He saw Anna's face in his mind, her gray eyes, fierce yet fragile, and that letter she clung to like a lifeline. The town didn't know her, didn't know the fire in her soul, but their judgment was a noose, tightening around her. Back at the ranch, night fell, the sky a bruise of purple and black. Lucas found Anna in the kitchen, scrubbing pots, her hands red from the cold water. She didn't look up, but her shoulders were tense, as if she felt the town's words from miles away. "You heard them, didn't you?" she said, her voice low, the rag still in her hand. "In town. They're talking about me." Lucas leaned against the doorframe, his hat tipped back, his eyes searching hers. "Let them talk," he said, his voice rough but steady. "They don't know you." Anna set the rag down, her fingers trembling. "They know enough. My pa's name, what they say he did. They think I'm here to take what ain't mine." She pulled the letter from her pocket, its edges curling, and held it up. "This is all I got of him, but it's a stain to them. I can't stay if it drags you down, Mr. Hale." Her voice broke, but her eyes held his, defiant even in pain. Lucas stepped closer, the floor creaking under his boots. "You saved my life," he said. "You think I care about their lies?" She shook her head, stepping back. "You got a name here, a place. I'm nobody, just a shadow they'll use to tear you apart." Her words were a knife, cutting through the silence. Lucas's hands flexed, wanting to reach for her, to pull her from the weight of her fear, but he held back. "You ain't nobody," he said, his voice low, like gravel underfoot. "You're the only one who's seen me clear in years." Anna's breath caught, her eyes searching his. But before she could speak, Martha burst in, her face pale. "Riders on the ridge," she said. "Tully's men, back for blood." The air shifted, sharp with danger, and Lucas knew the town's whispers were only the beginning of the storm about to break. The threat of Tully's riders hung over Blackthorn Ranch like a gathering storm, their shadows on the ridge a warning that the fight for survival was far from over. Lucas Hale's words to Anna, "You're the only one who's seen me clear," had lit a fragile spark of trust. But the Wyoming wind carried a chill that promised more than snow. Dawn broke sharply and brittle, the valley shrouded in mist, as Lucas rallied his men to fortify the ranch. Barricades rose from salvaged timber, rifles were cleaned, and sentries took their posts. But Lucas's mind was on Anna, her defiance against the town's venom, her letter a tether to a past she couldn't escape. The day passed in a tense blur, the ranch a fortress under siege. Lucas patrolled the perimeter, his Colt a familiar weight, his eyes scanning the hills for movement. Anna worked alongside the hands, hauling supplies, her hand steady despite the fear in her gray eyes. By dusk, the riders hadn't come, but the air crackled with anticipation, like the moment before a lightning strike. Lucas found Anna by the corral, mending a torn saddlebag, her fingers deft despite the cold. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice low, rough with the weight of what was coming. "Tully's men, they'll use you to get to me." Anna's needle paused, her gaze meeting his, unyielding. "I ain't running," she said, her voice steady as iron. "I've lost too much to let fear take what's left." She pulled her father's letter from her pocket. Its ink faded, but its weight was eternal. "Pa fought for truth, even when it killed him. I'll fight for this place, for you." Lucas's chest tightened, her words stirring the ember she'd kindled in him. He wanted to argue, to send her to safety, but her resolve was a mirror to his own, and he couldn't look away. As night fell, the ranch grew quiet, the men's voices hushed under the looming threat. Lucas led Anna to the hill where the scorched oak stood, its blackened branches clawing at the starless sky. He hadn't been there since the night his family died, but tonight, with Anna beside him, it felt different. Not a grave, but a reckoning. "This tree," he said, his voice gravelly, "saw everything I lost. I thought it'd always be my end." He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "But you're making me think it could be a start." Anna's breath caught, her fingers tightening on the letter. "I've carried my pa's shame like a brand," she said, her voice soft but fierce. "But standing here with you, I feel free." She stepped closer, the wind tugging at her shawl, and Lucas saw the girl who'd thrown him a gun, who'd faced fire and gossip without breaking. He reached for her hand, her skin cold but steady, and felt the world shift beneath his boots. The wedding was set for dawn, under that same oak, a quiet vow to defy the storm. The preacher arrived, his coat dusted with snow, his Bible worn from years on the frontier. Lucas's men stood guard, rifles ready, but the ridge remained empty. Tully's threat held at bay by the ranch's defiance. Anna wore a simple white dress, borrowed from Martha, its hem brushing the frozen ground. She held her father's letter, not as a burden, but as a talisman, her scar catching the first light of day. Lucas stood tall, his coat brushed clean, his Colt holstered but ever present, his eyes fixed on her like she was the only truth he'd ever known. The preacher's words were brief, the wind carrying them away as Lucas and Anna spoke their vows. "I ain't promising you an easy life," Lucas said, his voice low, steady. "But I'm promising you all I got. My name, my fight, my heart." Anna's eyes shone, her voice clear. "I promise to stand with you, Lucas, through storms and shadows, 'cause you've given me a home." When the preacher declared them husband and wife, Lucas kissed her, the oak's shadow framing them, its scars a testament to their shared survival. The valley stretched before them, its snow glittering under the rising sun. The ranch stood battered but unbowed, its people united under a new dawn. Lucas took Anna's hand, her letter now tucked against her heart, and felt the weight of his past ease, replaced by a future he dared to believe in. The wind still howled, but it carried no threats now, only the promise of a life built on trust, forged beneath a scorched oak that had witnessed their rebirth. The Wyoming wind carries Lucas and Anna's tale to a close, their love forged beneath a scorched oak, a testament to redemption in a harsh frontier. Their journey from grief to hope leaves us wondering, what sparks can heal a broken soul? I'm grateful for you joining me in this story of grit and heart. Please share your thoughts. What moved you most about Lucas and Anna's fight for justice? Drop a comment with your reflections and where you're listening from. Your voices keep these tales alive. Until we meet again under the wide western sky, keep the fire of courage burning. Farewell for now, friends.